Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It is a very special pleasure today to see so many people here for the latest in our recurring series of discussions of Abenomics. The economics initiative known as Abenomics in Japan is attracting great attention around the world in economic circles as a huge experiment and test case, and of course in politics throughout East Asia, and its impact on the TPP, where our institute and more importantly perhaps the U.S. government is doing so much work. And of course Abenomics matters to markets, and we have many distinguished market participants here today, but most of all, Abenomics is about the economic revitalization of Japan and what it means for the Japanese people. We could not have anybody better to talk about that to us than today, the Minister of State for Regulatory Reform, Administrative Reform, Civil Service Reform, and the Cool Japan Strategy, Tomomi Inada. Ms. Inada has been a three-term parliamentarian in the Diet, re-elected from Fukui Prefecture. She has a law degree from Waseda. She's been the author of several books about Japanese politics and is, among other things, the most senior woman in the Japanese cabinet. I personally love being able to introduce someone who's in charge of Cool Japan Strategy. I lived in the UK and at the end of Tony Blair's Cool Britannia Strategy, and Cool Japan seems to be going better so far, and no doubt that's because of Minister Inada. But in all seriousness, we're very grateful to the Minister for taking the time to share her views with this serious audience and making the commitment of her staff from the Cabinet Office and our friends at the Japanese Embassy to make this event possible. The Minister will be using an English language PowerPoint, but will also be speaking with translation. Copies of the PowerPoint are available outside and will be on our website to go with her remarks, which we're broadcasting live. And without any more delay, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the Peterson Institute Minister Tomomi Inada. Thank you, Madam Minister.
Good afternoon. My name is Tomomi Inada. I would first like to begin by extending my gratitude for your invitation to today's lecture. It is truly my pleasure to meet all of you here in Washington, D.C. today. I have been to the United States many times. My husband and I spent our honeymoon in Hawaii. Since then, Hawaii and the West Coast have been the favorite holiday destinations for our family. We often bring our two children and sometimes even our parents. However, this is my first time to visit the East Coast. My image of the East Coast is very much a product of the film The Verdict, that shows the scene of an early morning in Boston with beautiful hills and slopes. I began my career originally as a lawyer, and I served an attorney for more than 20 years. In those days, every time I lost motivation or got depressed when I felt justice failed, I watched that film again and persuaded myself and justice would surely prevail. My image of the U.S. is a country whose citizens guide law and justice. This view might have come from the words of The Verdict that Frank Yarvin, acted by Paul Newman, said in his closing argument. Frank said to the jury, "You are the law," and this scene has always remained with me. I saw this film more than 30 times, and my husband, who is also a lawyer, likes to watch it as well. After watching it, he stuck around for a while like Paul Newman. As a member of the Abe cabinet, my area of work includes regulatory reform, administrative reform, civil service reform, and Cool Japan strategy. Put simply, I am in charge of reform. All these individual reforms are linked very closely to one another. For example, regulatory reform, which is today's topic, can only be realized through the advancement of administrative and civil service reform. I would like to discuss this point in detail later on. My political motto is tradition and creation. To truly reform is to create something new while maintaining tradition. Reform without tradition, without a platform, without basis is just empty. At the same time, merely maintaining traditions suffocates any hopes for reform. I believe in preserving that which must be preserved, and that continual reform is necessary to achieve this end. To complement my self-introduction, I would first like to talk about what Abenomics and regulatory reform means to me. Then, I will explain the individual cases that the Council for Regulatory Reform is working on. For the individual case, I will use Japanese to make sure that you don't get confused because of my English. As I said in the beginning, I was originally a lawyer, and I did not intend to become a politician. However, when I asked myself what I could do for the country, I realized that what a lawyer can do is to preserve Japan's interest through the courts and bring about the justice in which I believe. I quote my favorite film, The Verdict: "The court exists to give the weak a chance at justice." This belief led me to a career in politics. The last 2 or 3 years before running for election, I was trying some cases as a volunteer because I felt their verdict would bring justice to society. And on weekends, I was traveling across Japan to attend conferences as a speaker. Only God knows the turning point in your life. In summer 2005, I was giving a lecture to young Liberal Democratic Party members of the Diet about the cases I was involved with. And among the attendees was Mr. Abe, who was then the acting Secretary General of the LDP. Immediately after this event, I was asked by Mr. Abe to join the party and decided to run as a candidate for election to the House of Representatives. I was fortunate enough to be elected, and this is how I started my career as a congresswoman. Whether or not to run was a big decision for me. It was my husband who forced my hand. He said, "You have been working hard in the courts to make this country better. But if you really want your dream to come true, becoming a congresswoman of the LDP will be the best way." Perhaps he regrets saying it. Prime Minister Abe and I have shared the same political beliefs when I was a lawyer, and we have always agreed in the political arena as well. Mr. Abe became Prime Minister in September 2006, but he resigned in September of the following year due to illness. Mr. Abe was harshly criticized, and nobody imagined that he would once again become Prime Minister. However, Mr. Abe ran as a candidate for the president of the LDP in 2012. The majority of people, and especially the media, thought that he had no chance to victory. Even those supporting Mr. Abe said that he should run in the next election scheduled for 3 years later. But Mr. Abe's decision was firm. If I do not become the first prime minister after the LDP takes back the administration from the Democratic Party of Japan, I will never be able to change Japan. That was his idea, and I strongly supported his decision. What Mr. Abe pledged during the election campaign was a new dawn for Japan, and he captured a miraculous victory in the election for the presidency of the LDP. I will say that Japan as a country is harsh on those who fail or quit. Mr. Abe's comeback thus gave courage to many Japanese people. A true champion is not someone who does not fail, but who stands up again even after they fail. Mr. Abe's dream is to return Japan to all its splendor as the heart of the world. And to achieve his dream, he had to first revitalize the economy from the ground up. Abenomics is thus the manifestation of Mr. Abe's strong desires in the form of economic policy. The three arrows idea of Abenomics comes from a story of Motonari Mori, a famous general in the 16th century. General Mori said to his sons, "You can break a single arrow easily, but you cannot break 3 arrows bounded together. That is why, my sons, you must cooperate with each other." The first arrow that comprises Abenomics is an aggressive monetary policy. The second arrow, a flexible fiscal policy. And the third arrow, a growth strategy. Coming back to what General Mori said, it is important that these 3 arrows are implemented integrally. So far, Abenomics is showing successful results. According to the 2013 IMF economic forecast, real-term GDP growth rate in Japan is the highest of major developed countries, including the US and EU. The consumer price index is also rising. However, the long-term growth of Japanese economy cannot be achieved by monetary and fiscal policy alone. We can rebuild a strong economy with a growth strategy that increases Japan's potential growth capacity. And regulatory reform is absolutely necessary to build a sound growth strategy. In this sense, regulatory reform is tightly connected to growth strategy, and hence is the most important part. I believe that the 3 reforms that I am in charge of, regulatory reform, administrative reform, and civil service reform, also constitute 3 arrows. In other words, in order to enhance regulatory reform, administrative and civil service reforms cannot be dealt with separately. Administrative reform is an old and new issue in Japan. Japan has implemented such reform for decades, such as the privatization of national railways and telecommunications corporations, as well as eliminating inefficiencies in the public sector. Recent reform tends to emphasize cuts to budget and personnel, yet administrative reform in its most basic form is like a gigantic experiment to determine the direction of a country. The essential issues such as the size of the government, the role of the public and the private sector, and the delegation of authority to local governments must be discussed. Whereas administrative reform determines the direction of the country, regulatory reform is a tool to discuss the necessary regulation to support such a heading. In order to conduct nationwide discussions, I established a panel called the Advisory Panel on the Future of the Nation and Administration. During the first session of the panel, I quoted the famous words of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country, as a greeting to the new members. I believe that the direction Japan should take is not just to become an economic superpower, but a country that is respected and reliable thanks to a high standard of ethics and virtues. The civil service reform is to eliminate the ill effect of sectionalism within the government that has lingered since the Meiji era, and to create and implement a government-wide strategy that focuses on ability. There is a saying in Japan that ministries are not interested in the interests of the administration. This means that instead of prioritizing in the intentions of each government administration of which they are a part, each ministry tends to prioritize and pursue their own interests. This does not help to promote regulatory reform. Ministries prefer to strengthen the regulations in their respective policy area. Why? Because they have discretion in regard to personnel matters. It might sound like a joke to you, but in Japan, the cabinet does not have the power to allocate personnel required to initiate its policies. I think that the cabinet should be able to centrally manage personal issues concerning senior public servants in the ministries. From that perspective, the establishment of proposed Cabinet Personnel Bureau will be a historical step that no one has ever taken. The bill has already been submitted to the Diet, and I will strive to obtain its approval by spring of this year. I am working hard on 3 categories of reform in an integrated manner: regulatory reform, administrative reform, and civil service reform, hoping that they will play a central role in launching the third arrow of Abenomics. これからは日本語でやらせていただきます。
Now allow me to speak in Japanese.
それでは私と規制改革会議が現在取り組んでいる規制改革の個別の論点について紹介をしたいと思います。
Now, I would like to introduce to you the individual regulatory reform items that the Council for Regulatory Reform and myself are currently involved in.
規制改革の対象は極めて多岐にわたりますが、今日は特に重要なもの、つまり医療保険改革、雇用制度改革、農業改革の3点に絞ってお話をします。
There are many target areas for our regulatory reform, but today let me focus on 3 items which have significance, namely the medical insurance reform, employment system reform, and the agricultural reform.
医療保険改革についてですが、医療技術はまだまだ進歩成長する分野です。そして経済成長の大きな要因になると考えています。
Now, first is the medical insurance reform. You see, the medical technology is an area that still has a great potential for growth and progress. And it also has a potential for great economic growth as well.
それらを支える医療保険制度について、日本は国民全員を被保険者とする いわゆる国民皆保険制度を採用をいたしております。その制度の下で、当然のことながら、保険の対象となる医療技術を限定しています。問題が生ずるのは、その対象となっている技術と、新しく開発された技術と、まだ対象となってないものを併用した場合です。その場合、現状では、どちらの技術も全額自己負担となってしまいます。
Now, of course, to talk about the medical insurance system, under the current system, Japan has the universal healthcare coverage, meaning that every Japanese national is covered by the health insurance. However, under this current system, we do need to limit the types of medical treatments that is covered by insurance. Now, the problem is that there are type of treatments that are covered under insurance, and that types of treatments that are newly developed that are not covered by insurance. And in the instances in which the medical treatments, both of the medical treatments are used, unfortunately, the patient him or herself need to pay the entire cost for the treatment.
しかしこの規制には以下のような問題があると私たちは考えています。第一に、自らの負担と判断で保険的の医療技術を用いると高額の負担を強いられるため、患者にとっても医師にとっても選択権が限定をされてしまいます。
You see, there are problems with this type of regulation. First of all, due to the high cost associated with the medical treatment that is not covered by insurance, that fact itself limits the choices for the patients and physicians.
第二に、安全かつ有効であっても、必要な治験にかかる費用が回収できないといった商業的な理由等のために、保険適用されない医療技術があって、それらの利用がとても困難になっています。
Second of all, even when a particular medical treatment is deemed to be safe and also deemed to have efficacy, due to the commercial reason that the cost for development cannot be, the cost for the clinical trial cannot be collected. At times, these type of treatments, it is hard to be used.
第3に、高い費用がかかる医療技術が開発されている中、すべての保険を対象しようと保険財政が破綻しかねません。これは医療技術の進歩を促す観点からも、また困っている患者を救う観点からも、これらの3つの点について改革すべきだというふうに考えています。
Now, due to the high cost of treatment development, of course, we cannot simply afford to cover every single medical treatment. If we do that, the medical insurance system itself will go bankrupt. Therefore, in order to enhance the medical technology development and also to aid those patients in need, I believe that there is a need for regulatory reform.
2点目は雇用制度改革についてです。
The second point I'd like to talk about is the employment system.
経済成長の一つのモーターは労働力です。労働力が適切に活用される。また、労働者にとって喜びや誇りを持ちながら働き、生活とのバランスを取ることはとても大切です。
You see, workers are one of the motors for economic growth. And in order for the workers to be appropriately utilized and also for them to work with joy and pride, it is important for them to have a good balance between their life and their job.
現在の日本でまず解決すべき点は2つあります。一つは女性の社会進出をもっともっと促すことです。そしてもう一つは企業間、産業間の労働力の移動を円滑にすることです。いわゆる柔軟で多様な働き方のできる社会を構築をすることです。これらのために次のようなことを改革をしていきます。
I believe there are two aspects that must be changed in current Japan. First of all, is that we must encourage more and more females to go to the work to enter the workplace. And the other is to make it more flexible for workers to transfer between among companies and also among industries. In other words, I believe it is important to establish a society in which people can work in a flexible flexible manner. And therefore, we will be reforming the following items.
一つは職務、勤務地、労働時間を限定せずに働くことが一般である、今の日本での雇用慣行を変えるのです。そのために職務などいずれかが限定されるジョブ型正社員の雇用ルールの整備を行います。
First of all, it is important to change the current working condition in Japan. It is typical for anyone to work without having a clear job description, job location, or working hours. Therefore, we believe that is important to establish employment rules for what's called so-called job type permanent employees whose job descriptions in other job arrangements should be clearly defined.
また、労働時間規制の改革を行います。女性の社会進出を促すため、保育制度の改革に着手をしています。それと、2030運動を展開しています。2030とは、2020年に女性の管理職を 30% に高めることを意味をしています。その私の後に、今次々にこの場でスピーチする日本女性が出てくることを後押ししていきたいと思います。
Additionally, we will also reform the working hours regulation in order to encourage more females to work in. We will work on reforming the child care system. And also, we are currently launching the 2030 movement. Namely, what this means is that we are aiming to reach the ratio of females in the management positions to 30% by year 2020. And we will be encouraging Japanese females so that there will be another or more Japanese females who will be making a speech like this.
3点目は農業の改革です。農業、食品産業分野にはまだまだ未開拓な成長の種があります。特に生産性を上げる余地は大きいです。昨年、政府は12月に農林水産業地域の活力創造プランを決定をいたしました。
The third item is the agricultural reform. The agricultural and food industry is there. In the agriculture and food industry, there are still many seeds of growth that is not yet cultivated. And I believe there is big room to increase the productivity. Therefore, the government has decided the agricultural agricultural and marine industry the Region Vitality Creation Plan last December.
目的は明確です。経営感覚を持ち、自らの判断で消費者等のニーズの変化に対応をする、チャレンジ精神のある農林水産業経営者が活躍できる環境を作ります。そのために必要な規制改革を行います。
The goal is, or the purpose is rather clear. It is for us to create an environment in which business owners, particularly the agricultural and marine business owners who is not afraid of challenges in order for them to meet the change in the needs of the consumers. And I believe that they can do so with their wonderful business sense.
例えば我が国では農地についての権利移転に関して、それぞれの市町村ごとに設置をされた地域の農業者から構成されている独立行政委員会である農業委員会の許可を得なければならないというような規制があります。企業を含めた多様なチャレンジする農業経営者のより一層の農業への参入や広域的な事業展開ができるよう、このような制度の規制を見直しを行っていきます。
Now, let me give you an example of in our country when there is a ownership transfer for an agricultural land, the parties involved must receive permission from their agricultural committee, which is the independent administrative committee, consisted of the regional farmers located in each municipalities. And we believe that it is important to change this type of regulation in order for more agricultural operators who is not afraid of challenges, and also other businesses will enter the agricultural market and to expand their business.
また農業者の組織として活動してきた農協協同組合は農業状況の急激な変化を反映して、組合員に兼業農家が増加をし、その設立当時に想定されていた姿とは、大きく変容をしています。そのため、改めてそれぞれの農業協同組合が個々の農業者の所得増大に傾注できるようにするなど、農業協同組合の制度の見直しを図ることとしています。
Additionally, the agricultural cooperative associations, which have originally designed for farmers, have increased their non-farmers and part-time farmers membership. Therefore, they have changed itself from what was originally designed. Therefore, I believe that it is important to review the current agricultural cooperatives system in order for them to put more of energy and focus on to increasing the farmers' income.
アベノミクスはまだ道半ばです。この1年で、総理のリーダーシップの質の高さは国民に確信を持たせました。そして人々の心が明るく前向きになってきました。
Abenomics is still ongoing. However, in this past year, the leadership of the Prime Minister, the high quality of the leadership, has given confidence to the people of Japan, and also it has really raised the mood for the people in Japan.
昨年の日本で流行した言葉に、いつやるのですか？今でしょうというのがあります。
You see, there is the phrase that became popular in Japan last year. It goes like this: When are you going to do it? It's now.
私は日本のため、世界のため、与えられた使命である3つのリフォームについて全力で取り組んでまいります。
I will devote myself to reform these 3 items, which I believe is my mission for Japan and for the world.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Madam Minister. That was terrific. I grew up in Boston. I didn't see the verdict 30 times, but I do remember the pursuit of justice. And it's always good to pursue justice at the same time you're pursuing efficiency. So let me start there. One of the most exciting aspects of Abenomics for people in Washington and I think around the world has been the commitment to try to increase female labor force participation and the representation of women in business and in leading roles like yours. We've done some work on it. Our friends at the IMF have focused on this in their talks about Japan. I was wondering if you could give us a little more about two pieces of that. First, in terms of numbers, what kinds of goals do you think are realistic for the increase in female employment over the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? And what sorts of employment? And second, although you didn't mention it, perhaps it seems to be part of Cool Japan that the Prime Minister spoke about what we would call an affirmative action program for women in boards and management of Japanese corporations. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about that as well.
最初の質問ですけれども、どういうことを目標にしているかということですが、まず、日本では2030運動、2020年に管理職の 30% というのを目標に置いています。ただ現実問題としてなぜ日本で女性がですねなかなか働き続けられないのか、いわゆる M 字カーブというのがあって、女性が子供を産めば仕事を辞めるという傾向にあります。まずそれを解消するために、安倍政権全体で子どもの保育所のですね数を増やしていく。今全国で4万人の子どもが保育所に入れずに待機しているということが言われておりますので、それをですね解消していこうということを考えています。
Yes, I believe your question has to do with the type of goals that we have. So specifically in Japan, as I mentioned before, we have a 2030 goal, and which is to say that our goal is to attain a 30% ratio of females in the management position by the year 2020. However, in reality, that is, we are not close to it. In reality, the reason why there are not many Japanese females in management position is due to the fact that many Japanese females tend to leave their job, particularly after they start having children. And there's something called a letter M curve, which shows that many females resign their work after they have children. Now, as the Abe administration, we have focused on the fact that there are not sufficient numbers of childcare facilities in our country, and currently there are around 40,000 children waiting to be taken care of by any childcare facility. So we believe it is important for us to really tackle with this problem and increase the number of the facilities.
2011年の調べでは、現在の管理職の女性の管理職の占める割合は 8.1%、30% にはなかなか届かないほど遠いという状況です。
You see, according to the study in 2011, the then ratio of females in management position was a mere 8.1%. So clearly, this is not close to the 30% goal we have.
2020年までに25から44歳の女性の就業率を現在の 68% から 73% に上げるという計画を立てています。
And currently, we have devised a plan to increase the employment ratio of females between age 25 and 44 years old from the current 68% to 73% by year 2020.
あと安倍政権において総理が成長戦略の中核に女性の活躍ということを常に発信しておられることも日本の女性に大変な勇気を与えています。
And the fact that the Prime Minister Abe himself is frequently commenting how important it is for females to work at the core of the economic growth in Japan, I believe this fact itself is giving a tremendous encouragement to the females in Japan.
2点目については日本でも大変議論のあるところであります。
The second point that I'd like to make to answer, really, this is a rather an opinion that has polarized in Japan.
ただ私としては女性が活躍してくれることはもちろんありがたいことですけれども、例えば女性だから大臣になれたんですねと言われることがあることはとても不愉快ですし、そうでないようにしていきたいというふうに思っています。
Now, of course, I do encourage females to really enhance in their positions. However, at the same time, I do not want to see a situation in which when a female becomes a minister, she is told that she became a minister because of her gender. I don't think that is something that should happen.
No, clearly not, but it's still good to have some female ministers nonetheless. If I could turn to a second point, you concluded with the rousing buildup of the word "do it now." Many of the people in this room have been anxiously awaiting many of the reforms you've mentioned for years, if not decades. So I'm not here simply to express skepticism, but to ask a more practical question. In the area of agriculture, you do have this list of goals and changes. How much do you integrate that with the government's TPP strategy? How much of that is dependent on the trade negotiations? Are the trade negotiations helpful? Or is this something that the Abe government is going to do whatever the U.S. and the TPP partners are discussing?
TPP において農業の問題というのはすごく重要なポイントであるというふうに安倍政権は捉えています。そして日本の農業、特に主食であるお米であったり農地であったり、それは守らなければならないということを考えていて、もちろん TPP に大変期待もしていますし、また農業が重要なウェイトを置いているということは安倍政権でも違いはないというふうに思います。
Now, in terms of TPP, agriculture is a very significant aspect, and that is the understanding of the Abe administration. And in Japan, again, agriculture is an important industry as well, with our rice in our agricultural land. They are something that the Abe administration believes that we must protect. Now, in terms of the weight of agricultural business in TPP, there is an understanding in the administration that it is rather heavy, and that in itself, Abe's administration's understanding is aligned with the other nations.
安倍政権ではすごくやっぱり TPP を 推進することが日本の経済成長にもなるということで、TPP の交渉の担当大臣も置いています。ですごくタフな交渉が続けられているというふうに聞いていますが、その内容についてはあまり知らされていません。そして私も担当ではないので詳しくはお話しできませんけれども、やはりその交渉がまとまることを大変日本では期待をしています。
Now, Prime Minister Abe himself really sees the high value in promoting TPP or the participant of Japan in it, and he believes that TPP is one of the important factors in the economic growth in Japan. Now, I understand that there is a TPP negotiation undergoing, and within the government, there is even a particular minister who is assigned for TPP-related matters. And I understand that there is a very tough negotiation taking place currently. Now, as far as the content of the negotiation, I am not told. Therefore, I am not really able to speak at this moment. However, I believe that there is an expectation in Japan that the negotiation will conclude, and that will conclude.
Okay.
ただ農業については官邸での会議と、それから産業競争力会議と規制改革会議と3つの政府の中の大きな会議で、改革について、話し合っていて、かつてないほど改革についてのですね、前向きな前進はあると思いますので、期待をしてもらいたいなと思います。
Now, in terms of the agricultural items, there are three locations that is discussing this particular matter. First is within the Prime Minister's office, and the second place is the Industrial Competitiveness Council, and then thirdly is the Regulatory Reform, the Council for Regulatory Reform. So there are three places that is discussing matters, and therefore I would like you to hope and have a forward or have a positive outlook that this item itself would progress in a positive manner.
Thank you. I'll ask one last question before turning it to the audience, if I may. Between your own leadership on administrative reform and the Council on Regulatory Reform you just mentioned, what sectors or industries do you think will show the early fruits, the early rewards of deregulation and change? Part of what from the outside has been impressive about Abenomics is some of the things on the macro side that were delivered quickly, such as what the BOJ has done. I'm wondering what you have in mind that will be visible to people, visible to business, visible to foreign investors in the next couple of years.
例えばクールジャパンストラテジーについてもそうですが、総理はその日本の良さをですね、どんどん発信をしていく。また総理いつも Buy My Abenomics とおっしゃってますが、海外の投資家がですね、日本に多く投資をしてもらえるようにという、そういう環境を作るということで、今規制改革会議でもさまざまな分野について取り組んでいて、私はそれが目に見える形になっていくというふうに思います。
You see, just to take a Cool Japan strategy itself, the Prime Minister himself is continuously making comments and promoting this strategy that in which the good image of Japan should be projected to the rest of the world. So And also, he himself often mentioned this phrase. He says, "Buy my Abenomics." In other words, he is encouraging the foreign investor to invest in Japan. And I believe that he is trying to create an environment in which more and more foreign investors can do that. And I believe, and also, in order to attain this, there are currently many items being discussed at the Council of Regulatory Reform.
で私がここに来るまでにシリコンバレーにも行ってきたんですけれども、例えばもう今ビジネスの仕方が随分そのスマートフォンとかですね、いろんなもので変わってきて新しい形のビジネスが生まれています。規制改革会議でも例えばビッグデータの活用とかそういうことについて、実はまだ日本の規制や法律が現在のその IT のですね技術の進歩にまだついていっていないというところがありますので、そういう点は規制改革やら法律の問題を解決することによって新しいビジネスを起こしていくということができるんじゃないかと期待をしています。
You see, right before I arrived in Washington, I visited Silicon Valley, and there I witnessed a new type of business emerging. Namely, some businesses are done by new technologies such as smartphone. Therefore, and at the same time, there are also corporations that are working on usage of big data. So in Japan as well, I believe that there are still a lot of big room for changing the regulations or current laws in order for the IT technology to enhance. However, under the current regulation, current laws, they are not keeping up with the technological advancement. Therefore, I believe that it is important to resolve this issue.
Very good. Thank you for that. I'm now going to open up to the floor. The minister has agreed to take questions on the record. We ask, as usual, that if you want to ask a question, you identify yourself before asking, and even if you have an opinion to state, you at least try to form it as a question. There is a microphone at the back. There's a traveling microphone in front. Jim will be first, I guess. But one other qualification. The minister is here today to talk about economic issues, including international economic issues, but not foreign policy, political issues. If anybody wants to ask about that, you'll be cut off because that's just not our mission here. So, Jim.
Minister, thank you very much. I'm James Fothery with the U.S.-Japan Business Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. Could you explain how your reform ideas, which seem to be broad, economy-wide reforms, match up with the current proposals to establish special regulation or deregulation zones? I know that that's a priority of the government also. They're, I think, in the process of selecting which locations and which ways those zones would apply. So if you could explain how the connection is between your broad reforms and these zones, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
You're asking about the regulatory reform?
昨年はですね、規制改革会議で、象徴的なものとしては薬のインターネット販売について、取り組んで 99.8% の、解禁をしました。
Last year at the Council for Regulatory Reform, we worked hard on enabling the internet sales of medicine, and we were able to open up the market by 99.8%.
なぜ今規制改革会議で議論されていることは、今までもずっと議論されていたことを続けて議論していることが多いんですけれども、安倍政権になってから何が変わったのかというと、私はやっぱり政治のリーダーシップっていうものが随分その規制改革を前進させる大きな要素になっていると思います。
Now, the contents of what has been discussed at the Council for Regulatory Reform, many of them has been something that has already been discussed in the past. However, at the same time, you see, if you ask me what has changed after Abe administration came in, I believe it really has to do with the political leadership that Abe himself is showing. That has dramatically changed, and that itself has really promoted the regulatory reform.
今、規制改革会議では6月に向けて3つの大きな改革に取り組んでいます。それは今日お話をした医療とそして農業と雇用の分野について取り組んでいます。
And at the Council for Regulatory Reform, we are currently discussing 3 issues, which is something that I have already shared with you, and we are aiming to have a conclusion by this June. Namely, the 3 items are the medical insurance, agricultural business, and the employment system.
It's good to have a staff.
Okay. Your question, 国家戦略特区との関係についてはですね、今言いましたように規制改革会議もずっと長年取り組んでいながらなかなか突破できない壁があります。もちろん政治のリーダーシップも重要なんですが、今回国家戦略特区というものを作って、私の役目は全国あまねく規制を改革することですけれども、それをいきなりやるということはなかなか難しい。そういう場合に、例えば今問題にしていた混合診療の問題にしてもそうですけれども、ある特定の区域を区切って、そこでまず規制改革をやってみて、その結果ですね、それが全国あまねくに普及できるということになればやっていく、まさしくこの国家戦略特区を突破口のようにですね使うということが今考えられています。
And yes, in terms of your question about the strategic district that you mentioned, you see, this is something that the council has been discussing for a long time. However, this is a pretty big obstacle for us. Of course, yes, the leadership did help for us to tackle with this issue, but this is something that is still a huge, tremendous obstacle for us. Now, of course, in an ideal world, I would like to implement the regulatory reform in the entire nation all at the same time. However, that is difficult. Therefore, our idea is to have a specific zones for this strategic districts or zone and implement the regulatory reform within these particular zones. And depending on the result, we will determine whether we will implement the regulatory reform nationwide. So, in other words, this strategic zone is something that we would like to overcome before we implement the reform in the entire nation.
戦略特区の諮問会議というのが設立をされて、そのメンバーの一人に規制改革担当である私も入っています。
And there is an advisory board for the strategic zone, and I myself have been assigned as one of the members because I am in charge of the regulatory reform.
Thank you. Krishna, please.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your presentation. Krishna Guha, Vice Chairman of ISI. As you know, the investor community has great interest in the growth agenda, the structural reform, the third arrow. I think everyone would agree that the type of reforms that are talked about would increase people's permanent incomes, expectations for households and businesses. But there is quite a lot of skepticism among the investors as to how much will actually be accomplished in the area of the third arrow. What are they missing? What do they not see that you see? And could you point to a few specific important developments you would expect to see this year that would give proof to the skeptics that the structural reforms are really happening in a major way?
公務員制度改革の内閣人事局が設置されることによって、私は規制改革は劇的に変わるというふうに思っています。なぜなら、今までなぜ規制が改革が進まなかったか、それはもちろん政治のリーダーシップの問題もありますけれども、むしろ各省が縦割りで、そしてその縦割りの中で、むしろ規制を強化した人が登用されるというシステムであったと言っても過言ではないというふうに思います。例えば、薬のインターネット
I believe that one of the things that you will see is that it is in the area of civil service reform. Now, there will be a new bureau particularly designed for personnel-related matters. Now, I believe that once this personnel bureau is established, our regulatory reform could significantly enhance. And the reason is this. Of course, an impetus for a good or successful regulatory reform, of course, one of them is leadership. However, the other reason would be and let me explain the second part, is that you see currently in Japanese ministries there are still sectionalism that exists, in which the type of personnel that are adopted in each agency or ministry is usually those who encourage a stricter regulation.
例えば先ほどの薬のインターネット販売も法律ではかけていない規制を厚労省の省の段階でかけていました。また保育の問題も株式会社の保育に対する参入を法律では規制はないにもかかわらず各その省でですね強化をしているということがありました。なぜそうなるのかというと、規制を強化することがむしろ省の利益を守って、そしてその人が登用されるという仕組みを根本的に変えないと、私は規制改革は進まない。その意味において内閣人事局を設置をして、内閣において幹部のですね人事をきちんとグリップするということが規制を前に進ませる、目に見えて前に進ませる要因になると確信しています。
And just to give you an example, you see, for the medicine internet sales that I just mentioned earlier, previously the Japanese health ministry has put a very strict regulation, despite the fact that there was no such law that existed in Japan that would regulate internet sales. And also for childcare system as well, there are many private businesses that is willing to enter the child care market. However, and there's no such law to prohibit that. However, the ministry is strengthening or is putting a strict regulation on this. And the reason is because, you see, by putting in place a stricter regulation, that actually benefits each ministry. You see, and also within the ministry, they have adopted a system to promote personnel who are willing to implement stricter regulation. Therefore, by establishing this personnel bureau in the cabinet's office and to give the authority to the cabinet office to hire and to assign personnel, in each ministry, I believe this will greatly help the regulatory reform to move forward.
Thank you. As you can tell from the first three questions, you go to the mic, that there is a great thirst for specifics, and we appreciate your getting to some of those at the moment. At the rear microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Mireya Solis from Brookings. Minister Inada, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I wonder if you could please discuss how would the proposed reforms address the issue of labor market dualism in Japan, where you have a group of permanent elite workers and then the non-permanent part-time workers, which actually already represent a third of the Japanese workforce, and then people believe that that system persists because of rigidities in hiring and firing practices. I understand it's not just about changing the law, but how the court interprets the law, and that the courts have set a very high standard. So what could the council do to promote this greater flexibility in hiring and firing that actually would help get women back into the workforce?
まず日本では終身雇用、そして、正社員というのが一般的にいいとされています。そして、一旦、勤めたら一生その会社にいて、自分の仕事ではなくてむしろその会社に従属しているという関係が一般的です。
You see, in Japan, as you may well know, the system of a person working for the same company for the entire career is quite common, and also there is a common belief that the permanent employee is a much preferable employment status. So, and also when someone starts working for a company, in their mindset, they're not really doing their particular job, but they're rather working for the company.
で、私たちが考えているのは、いろんな働き方の多様性を認めていくことが必要だということです。
Now, our belief is that it is important to recognize and also to encourage the diversity in the way people work.
例えば限定正社員というのは、職の種類だったり地域だったりそういうことが限定して、その仕事に着目をした正社員を認めていくということで、決してそれは首を切りやすくするということではありません。
Now, for the what we call the limited permanent employee, which is namely somebody whose job description or the job location is clearly defined. By increasing the numbers of this type of positions, I believe that they can focus more on their job itself. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not something that we are trying to promote so that the employers can fire them easily.
そして、正規か非正規かにかかわらずですね、非正規の人たちにもちゃんと自分のキャリアをアップしてもらえるようなそういうシステムも取り入れていこうということを考えています。
And whether it is the regular permanent employee or the non-regular permanent employee, we would like to create a system in which the non-regular employee can also build a career around that.
それとやはり私は再チャレンジ担当大臣もやってるんですけれども、日本では一回勤めた会社を辞めたり、それから違う会社に移ったり、また一回失敗したり倒産したりとした人に対して非常に冷たい社会でもあります。それがすごく硬直的な働き方につながっていると思います。そのマインドをチェンジすることによって失敗することが必ずしもいけないことではなくて、失敗したことを生かすことがいいんだというそういう意識の改革ということも同時に再チャレンジ担当大臣として取り組んでいくことによって例えば若者の起業というものも増やしていきたいと思います。
Now, I am actually one of my responsibilities is in a concept of trying again, or it's called retrying or challenge again. And you see, in Japan, once somebody resigns from a company or even try to change their job, or if somebody fails in their business, or if somebody's business go bankrupt, you see, the society of Japan is rather cold to these people. And I believe that leads to a very inflexible way that people work. Therefore, I believe that it is important to change that kind of mindset. In other words, I believe it is important for people not to think that failure is a bad thing, but rather for people to change their way of thinking so that they can think about how to utilize from what they learn from their failure. So that is something that I myself, as a minister of challenging again, is something that I like to work on.
Of course, Prime Minister Abe challenged again after his failure. Is there another question from the audience, please?
Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute. Thank you, Madam Minister, for a very interesting talk. I'm going to ask, as we say, 30,000-foot question about the role of your council in this process. Does it have? Is it, in terms of working with other parts of the government, is it advisory? Right? Or can you, if I put it that way, order other ministries to do things? That's the first part. And then I presume in some cases, some of the things you want to do require changes in law, right, rather than just regulation, presumably that. But to what extent is that involved? So if you give us a little bit an idea of how the process, right, as you put in your PowerPoint, you said the council will develop a plan. The question is the implementation beyond the council's work of that plan, and how that would work with respect to those particular areas in which you've informed us very well. Thank you.
今ご指摘になったように規制改革会議自体はですね、諮問会議のような役割をしています。したがって規制改革会議で決めたことがすなわちそのまま法律改正になるということはない。しかし規制改革会議は総理の諮問機関でもありますので、そこで閣議決定の中に規制改革で出した結論を入れてもらうことによってそれぞれの省の法律の改正に対しては影響力があります。それも縦割り行政であったり、また内閣のリーダーシップが非常に重要になるゆえんであります。
Yes, you see, our Council for Regulatory Reform, it is mainly has an advisory function. Therefore, it is not to say that what we have decided or at our opinion does not directly result in a change in the law. However, you see, we are the advisory body for the Prime Minister himself, so our opinions will be incorporated into the discussion that takes place at the cabinet meeting, and also therefore, at times our opinion can influence the way that each ministry. Influence the laws that of each ministry. That is why it is important to really work on the sectionalism of our administrative body, and also the strong leadership does also count.
基本的には規制改革会議というのは、いろんな各省からすると嫌われ者の役割をしていると言ってもいいかと思います。むしろ規制改革会議が厄介で、 本当に、嫌なことばかりいつも言っているというのが、各省から見た規制改革の立場だと思います。
You see, I believe I'm pretty sure that our council is hated by a lot of the ministries. I know that they are thinking that we always just say things that are just we are saying things that are not really pleasant for them.
しかしありがたいことに規制改革会議が今孤立しているのではなくて、産業競争力会議でも規制改革と同じようなテーマに取り組んでいて、そして官邸もどちらかというと、官邸もその改革を進めていこうというその精神がすごく旺盛なので、官邸そして産業競争力会議、規制改革と一体化することによって各省に圧力をかけていく。また内閣人事局で人事を握ることによって圧力をかけていくこと、それが規制改革を、単に提言だけではなくて本当に法律を変えるという結論を出すという結果につながっていくというふうに確信しています。
You see, it is not not to say that the Council for Regulatory Reform is an isolated is working this in an isolated manner. The truth is that there are other bodies that are also working on the same matters. For example, the Council for Industry Competitiveness is also working on the same issues, and also the Prime Minister's office itself is also working hard on promoting regulatory reform. And therefore, by these three bodies putting pressure on each ministry, and also by establishing the personnel bureau in the cabinet office, that also can put pressure on each ministry. So I am convinced that by these hard work can move the regulatory reform forward, and also that our council's function do not end merely by proposing items, but rather that our proposals will result in changes of the law.
で、普通は各省の後ろにやはり議員がいます。で、各省とそして党ですね、LDP 党に対してもしばしば戦わなければ、規制改革は戦わなければならなくて、その党の国会議員から総理に稲田大臣を止めてくれと苦情がたくさん寄せられているようです。
Oftentimes, behind the ministries, there are also congressional members as well, the Diet members, namely even my Liberal Democratic Party, LDP. There are members who are trying to block my work in regulatory reform. I hear that many of the members have complained and asked to stop my hard work.
It's funny. We 110 years ago, we had President Theodore Roosevelt, who came in and was seen as a great reformer, and like the Abenomics program, part of his motivation was so that the U.S. could play a stronger role in the world stage. And he also began with civil service reform, actually, at the time, and had to keep fighting congressional opposition. So we know what you mean. Longwood would say, we know what you mean. Is there another question from the audience before we let the minister go? Nope. Let me just ask one last thing. And again, thank you so much for your frankness and your engagement with our audience and your time today. One thing which seems to be missing from your agenda, and if it's not on your agenda, I worry I don't know whose agenda it's on, is issues of corporate governance reform in Japan. Now, the U.S. has lost some stature to complain about other people's corporate governance in recent years. But that's another way of saying we can see how destructive it can be when corporate governance, what companies do with shareholders' money effectively, is not well managed. A particular common threat now across the U.S., the OECD, and Japan, including Japan, is non-financial corporations sitting on very large pools of cash and neither giving them back to investors neither giving them back to shareholders, nor investing. Japan was ahead of the curve on this and remains facing this problem. Is this an issue of concern to you and your colleagues on the economic side, how to revitalize investment in corporate Japan?
おっしゃる通りだと思います。日本の企業はとても内部留保がたくさんあって、それを投資とかにですね、回していないという現実があると思います。それはやっぱりそういうところをですね、変えていくことによって、規制改革、どういう今その内部留保をいかに投資に回すかということについても、規制改革自体では今取り上げていませんけれども、安倍内閣において非常に重要な論点だというふうに考えられています。留保で内部中に溜め込んで使ってないっていう。
Yes, you are absolutely right. There is a large pool of money in many Japanese corporations that are just simply being stored and without being used, and that must be used for investment. And I believe that by changing regulation, we could encourage the money to be used for investment, and it is not to say that that is not part of my responsibility. However, it is the belief that the Abe administration itself does have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. The Peterson Institute is very proud to be the primary place for substantive discussion of Abenomics as well as many other international economic issues. And your comments today took us a huge step further in creating understanding and exchange of Abenomics between U.S. and Japan. And I'm grateful to our distinguished audience for joining us. Please join me in thanking Minister of State for Regulatory Reform as well as Minister in charge of Cool Japan, Tomomi Inada.
ありがとうございます。